Well, perhaps I need to introduce myself, not Prabhat. In any case, in the next, as all of you know, in this series of fascinating lectures in nationalism, we have Professor Prabhat Patnaik. I don't need to introduce him because I think he holds some kind of a record in terms of the number of lectures he's taken within the classroom and outside the classroom in this campus over the years he's been here. If I recall right, after Utsa came here, he returned from Cambridge, where he gave up his job to come and teach here, reflecting the kind of commitment and excellence which characterizes a lot of people who came to teach in JNU from that point of time and created this university as it is. And therefore, I think it's appropriate, like others who came before him, that he speaks to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, I have been traveling a lot. I went to Calcutta, I went to Bombay, I went to Tejpur. Everywhere I go, the fact that I'm from JNU is something which makes people sit up and take notice of me. And that is precisely because of the kind of resistance of which this particular meeting is actually an exhibition. And therefore I'm very gratified that in this list of lectures you have called me to speak as well. As Chandru said, I have given innumerable lectures. In fact, at a rough reckoning, I have probably given more than 4,000 classroom lectures in JNU, but nothing like this. And as a result, it's a unique experience from me as well. When we typically, the term nationalism is always discussed as if it is a homogeneous category, which is wrong. All of us would draw a distinction between the nationalism invoked by Hitler and the nationalism invoked by Gandhi. But even though we do that, in a good deal of the literature, a good deal of the conceptual literature, this distinction is not drawn. As a matter of fact, the entire trajectory of nationalism in Europe was very different from the kind of nationalism that came to prevail in the Third World in the course of the anti-colonial struggle. Europe was a place where the nation-state, nationalism, they came into vogue in the 17th century after the Westphalian treaties, which ended the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War. This nationalism which came into vogue in Europe had, to my mind, at least three very important characteristics. The first characteristic is that it always looked at an enemy within. The Jews everywhere, Catholics in Northern Europe, which was Protestant, Protestants in Southern Europe, which was Catholic, and therefore there was always a nationalism which picked out an enemy within. It was not an inclusive nationalism, but it was actually a nationalism that was directed against an enemy within. The second feature is that it was a nationalism which was actually imperialist from the very beginning. Oliver Cromwell, within days almost of the Westphalian treaties, invaded Ireland, which was the first colony of conquest in the world. And then, of course, we know that in India, elsewhere, the colonial powers who in Europe were living in peaceful coexistence of sorts at that time were engaged in struggles in Carnatic here and so on. We know that therefore there was all over the world a struggle for empire, and that was a part of that nationalism. That nationalism was associated with imperialism from its very inception. And the third feature of that nationalism, to my mind, is that it actually apotheosized the nation above the people. That it was not the people's living standards, the people's conditions of life which were important, but something called the power, the prestige, the wealth of the nation. This was not only true of the mercantilists who anyway believed in grabbing as much as possible to raise the nation's wealth, grabbing from other countries, that is. But it was even true of classical political economy. It was true of all the different bourgeois strands. Adam Smith's book, after all, was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Wealth of nations had to be raised, even though nowhere in the wealth of nations is there a suggestion that this increase in the wealth of nations is going to benefit the people at large, the working people. So the nation was apotheosized above the people. These features basically made European nationalism essentially an aggrandizing nationalism. In fact, countries which acquired nationhood rather late in history, Germany being the classical example, felt excluded from this universe of aggrandizement, because by that time the world had been more or less divided up between the English and the French and so on, and therefore pursued a particularly aggressive form of nationalism. And that aggressive form of nationalism at that time, when Germany became a nation, was associated in any case with financial interests, finance capital, which had become prominent within capitalism at that time. And all this was manifested, of course, in the World War, which was between rival financial oligarchies. And a well-known social democratic writer, Rudolf Hilferding, who wrote a book on finance capital, said that the ideology of finance capital is the glorification of the national idea. And this national idea, many of you would have read Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, basically is the kind of thing which was captured, and this national idea really got intensified through the war and reached its apogee under fascism, which in fact really raised it to the highest possible level. But fascism was the apogee of an aggrandizing nationalism. By contrast, when you look at countries like India, where nationalism developed as a part of the anti-colonial struggle, nationalism had to be inclusive, because you are taking on the might of an imperial power. This might of the imperial power could be taken on only if the people were united, and consequently it had to be an inclusive nationalism. It tried to bring about a situation where everybody was a part of this nationalism, as opposed to, as I said, the enemy within that characterized European nationalism. Because of which, incidentally, even today in Europe, in progressive circles, in the post-Second World War period, nationalism is a dirty word associated only with the right. While that's not the case in countries like ours necessarily, because our nationalism, being a nationalism that was anti-colonial, had to be inclusive. It was inclusive as far as the people in the country are concerned. It also had an enormous sympathy for nationalisms of an anti-colonial kind which were developing in other parts of the world. It had to have solidarity with the struggles of other people against colonialism, and consequently it was a nationalism that recognized the validity, the legitimacy of other nationalisms rather than excluding them, because it was a part of a common anti-colonial struggle. The third and the most important feature of this nationalism, to my mind, is that it did not glorify the nation above the people. And to my mind, the classic quote is from Gandhi, who talked about freedom consisting in wiping away the tears from the eyes of every Indian. In other words, the idea was the people, that the nation was not above the people, nation was about the people. And therefore, these were some of the ways in which our anti-colonial nationalism was fundamentally different from the aggrandizing nationalism that developed in Europe and reached, as I said, its zenith in the period of fascism. But all this nationalism of the Third World, not only India, elsewhere in the Third World, had another feature which is very important, because in order to be inclusive, in order to bring in people into the anti-colonial struggle, it actually produced a kind of social contract. You look at the Freedom Charter in South Africa, you look at the Karachi Congress resolution in India, and elsewhere also, this kind of nationalism was really based on an agenda which in a sense was an agenda of inclusion, as an agenda of democracy, an agenda of egalitarianism. The Karachi Congress resolution, for instance, for the first time talked about universal adult suffrage being the basis for the formation of governments in post-independence India. It talked about many things. It talked about equality. It talked about juridical equality, equality before law. It talked about secularism in its own way, that the state will have no religion. It even talked about abolition of capital punishment, by the way. And it also talked about, abolition of capital punishment, which is very apposite at this time, because we are talking about Afzal Guru and Yaqub Memon and so on. And in 1931 Karachi Congress resolution, it was stated that free India will abolish capital punishment. And it talked about free and compulsory primary education, which we still really don't have, and so on. In many ways, it was really a charter. And that charter constituted a kind of implicit or explicit social contract on the basis of which our nationhood was formed. In other words, it was a nation which consisted of the people coming into nationhood, forming a nation state to replace the colonial state, or attempting to form a nation state to replace the colonial state. This was very different from, as I said, the aggrandizing nationalism of the European kind. Now, from the very inception, this inclusive nationalism really had a lot of internal enemies, as it were. One very obvious enemy is that if you're talking about equality, if you're talking about equality before law, if you're talking about universal adult franchise, in that case, you are really dealing an incredibly powerful blow to the millennia-old caste structure, in a situation of institutionalized inequality that had prevailed in our country for millennia. To talk about the fact that the Dalit would have the same political rights, the same vote, having the same value as the Brahmin, was really something which was a revolutionary statement. And the fact that it was done in 1931, let's not forget that in France, universal adult franchise came in 45, and in India in 1952. But it was visualized in 1931 itself. In Britain, universal adult franchise still had not come, though in 1928 women got the vote, and therefore there is substantial extension of the franchise. But the idea that you actually have everybody having an equal vote and therefore choosing the government together was something which was really a revolutionary concept as far as traditional India was concerned. In fact, I come from a village in Odisha, and I remember the 1952 elections in which my village had a lot of Brahmin landlords. They were scandalized that their vote would have the same value as the vote of the Dalits who happened to be in that village. So it was really a major, substantial change. And obviously, this substantial change had its own enemies to start with, traditional society, and particularly the Hindutvawadis. Our JNU, one of my colleagues, Professor Suviraj Jaiswal of the History Center, has argued, to my mind, very persuasively, that the essence of Hinduism is the caste system. That really there is, anything else can be altered, but the essence of Hinduism is the caste system. And the fact that you actually had a situation where a modern India was coming up that dealt a conceptual blow against the caste system was from the very beginning anathema as far as they are concerned. Many people, by the way, tried to look at, many people tried to look at the egalitarian tradition in India. Of course, there was a subterranean egalitarian tradition, but the basic dominant tradition, which was that of a society based on caste system, was inegalitarian. So I think looking at modern India, as in some sense a continuation of traditional India, is something which I really don't share very much. Modern India is one in which people are, as it were, raising themselves with their own bootstraps in order to constitute a nation, and it comes into being in the course of the anti-colonial struggle. The second kind of enemy of this inclusive democratic, egalitarian nationalism, which was a part of the anti-colonial struggle, of course, came from capital. Now, one can say that capitalism, because of its inherently inequalizing tendencies, is really incompatible with the coming into being of such a nation. Because if the idea is egalitarian, then of course capitalism is not the way to do it. And in fact, whether you look at Gandhi, whether you look at Ambedkar, whether you look at Nehru, they all believed that somehow capitalism is not the solution to India's problem. Each of them had a different idea about what the solution was in terms of the economic regime. But all of them were united on this because they could see that capitalism, which is basically inequalizing tendencies, was really not the answer to the kind of modern India based on a new social contract that was coming into being. For a while, as we know, what we tried to develop in the Nehruvian era was a controlled capitalism, a regulated capitalism, in which the idea was even though capitalists are there, they would be so hamstrung, they would be so tied up because of controls and regulations and so on, that really they cannot do much damage, that in some sense we do away with the inequalizing tendencies of capitalism. But of course, with that was not true to start with, and with neoliberalism, even those controls have all gone, and now, as we know, in these few years, inequalities have risen dramatically, and you have the formation of a new corporate financial oligarchy, which is much more aligned to the advanced countries, which is much more aligned to global finance than having anything to do with the Indian economy seen as an integrated unit. Our corporate groups go and buy companies elsewhere, they go and take over companies elsewhere, just as imperialist companies try and take over companies here. So you have a situation where you have the new corporate financial oligarchy obviously emerging as a major opponent of that inclusive concept of nationalism, because that inclusive concept of nationalism is fundamentally in opposition to all that neoliberalism stands for. Consequently, these two, namely on the one hand, those who are Hindutvavadis, who are defenders of the caste system, whether they admit it or not, I mean, no matter what stances they adopt, fundamentally, they are defenders of the caste system on the one side, and of course, the modern corporate financial oligarchy on the other. They come together, and they come together to do a trick. They come together to oppose inclusive nationalism, and they do so through a trick. And that trick consists in the fact that they substitute an aggrandizing nationalism for the democratic, egalitarian, inclusive nationalism. And that is what I mean by saying it's very important to draw distinctions. You know, this is happening every day. Yesterday, I saw in the papers that Mr. Jaitley has accused Rahul Gandhi, saying, what is this? Your grandfather, or great-grandfather Jawaharlal Nehru, he talked of nationalism. Rajiv Gandhi talked of nationalism. Indira Gandhi talked of nationalism, but you are hobnobbing with the anti-nationals. You see, the nationalism that Nehru talked about and the nationalism in terms of which those that Rahul Gandhi is hobnobbing with are considered anti-national is not the same term. In other words, there is a deception whereby the notion of nationalism as an inclusive, egalitarian, democratic concept is substituted by an aggrandizing nationalism, and the moral high ground that the former occupies is then sought to be claimed by the latter, saying that this is something which really we stand for. No, what you stand for is something very different from what Gandhi stood for. In fact, Gandhi was insistent that 55 crores of rupees should be handed over to Pakistan, which was due to them, against a lot of pressure at that time, including inside the Congress. So what Gandhi stood for as nationalism was very different from what you are calling nationalism. But you know, this verbal trick is playing a very important role in misleading people, and we should be sensitive to that. The second thing which I want to draw your attention to, two more points, then I'm through. The second thing which I want to draw your attention to is the following. that if it is a nationalism based on a social contract, implicit or explicit, in our case, even though there was an explicit document, it is understood that there is a kind of social contract on the basis of which modern India comes into being. Then how do you ensure that this contract is going to be honored? How do you ensure that actually there is no violation of this contract, at least by the dominant segments of society, the dominant groups of society, the dominant regions inside the country? There was a very simple answer that Lenin provided to it. And Lenin's answer was that in big overarching countries, which consist of large numbers of different linguistic ethnic groups, you allow the right to secession. If anybody feels that the contract is being violated, then such an entity must have the right to secede. And the fact that this right to secede is recognized would also make the dominant segments not do things that would make people secede. Now, of course, in India, the right to secede was never a part of the constitution. Kashmir has special status, but the right to secede was never written into the constitution. But precisely because it is not written into the constitution, it's very important that violations of the social contract, whenever issues are raised about such violations, must be discussed. In other words, there must be an openness through which people can raise issues about the violation of the social contract upon which the modern Indian nation is based. Now, if that is the case, then calling somebody anti-national, in my view, is against the spirit of this inclusive nationalism. In other words, one of the features of this inclusive nationalism is that the category of somebody being called anti-national just should not exist. Now, this is not okay. I know that this is not just a conceptual fact. As a matter of fact, there have been, in the past, a great degree of tolerance. There were transgressions. I believe Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah's arrest and so on was a transgression. But the point is that nonetheless, there was a degree of tolerance. For instance, for a very long time, the CPIM, the biggest communist party in the country, actually had in its program recognition of the right to secession. They changed it much later in the 70s, and on the grounds that this might be used by imperialism, not on the grounds that it's anti-national. When Jyoti Basu became Deputy Chief Minister of West Bengal in 67 and 69, the party he belonged to actually recognized the right to secession. And nobody said they were anti-national. Nobody said you can't become Deputy Chief Minister of West Bengal because your party is anti-national. So the fact that in the course of a people becoming a nation on the basis of a social contract, which is, as I said, egalitarian, democratic, and so on, many people would raise voices that the social contract is being violated is something which is to be accepted, which is to be recognized, which is to be tolerated. And typically, the ideal in India was to tolerate all this. The fact that we're not doing so today is because, as I said, we have moved away from one notion of nationalism to another notion of nationalism. From the inclusive anti-colonial notion of nationalism to an alternative aggrandizing notion of nationalism. This aggrandizing notion of nationalism, to my mind, is the ideology of the corporate communal alliance which currently rules the country. And in fact, it's a very useful ideology because once you say national in this aggrandizing sense, and anybody who does not subscribe to your view becomes anti-national, it's a process of destruction of thought. Because, any thinking must be associated with raising questions. And when you raise questions, there'll be multiplicity of answers. And consequently, in any society at any given time, there would always be people holding all kinds of different views. If those views are suppressed on the grounds of their being anti-national, then you are ipso facto destroying thought, ipso facto suppressing thinking. And if you do that, then effectively you're putting pebbles into people's minds. And once you do that, then you can say that national, well, okay, observing Karwa Chauth is national and not doing so is anti-national. Eating beef is anti-national, and so on. So that, then you can shift the discourse in a way where national then gets identified with the practices of the Hindu religion. Now, this destruction of thought is really of a very serious kind, and what is more, it is not surprising that the most excellent institutions of the country, whether it's the Pune Film Institute, whether it is the Fine Arts Department of MS University, Baroda, whether it is JNU, of course, whether it's Hyderabad Central University, whether it's Jadavpur University, which is really an excellent university, you find that these are all the places where the attack is taking place. There's another feature about these places I want to draw your attention to. They're all publicly funded institutions. You don't find opposition arising in private universities, private institutions. I'm not blaming those students, but because they already have got commoditized. In other words, the process of destruction of thought is something which has already got institutionalized there. The few places which, because of their publicly funded character, still constitute locations of critique, of discussion, of intellectual excellence, are the places which are now being targeted. Now just imagine if a government actually destroys the best institutions of the country, destroys thought, effectively then what are you doing? You're making the country parasitic on foreign countries for ideas. And these are the people who are talking about nationalism. In other words, really speaking, you actually make yourself completely dependent upon imperialism for ideas, and you talk about nationalism. So the struggle that we are engaged here in JNU is one which really is for exposing this aggrandizing nationalism, which is for defending thought, defending the critical tradition which has been built up here, striving for excellence, which alone is a guarantee that we would be able to respect the social contract on the basis of which this nation was formed. I wish you all success. Thank you.